The purpose of this course is to explore the dramatic changes in the global Christian movement. We're living in a time of unprecedented growth of the church around the world, and it's having a massive impact on how we think about and discuss theology. And yet so often we're unaware of all of this, and part of this course is to help us to think differently about theology and how the global church is helping us to shape and think about this whole process. I compare it a little bit like to those old medieval maps that perhaps you've seen the early 1300s, where you have a map that shows a picture of the world. And of course, Europe is in the center of the world. The word Mediterranean literally means Middle Earth, Mediterranean. And essentially, you have beautiful, adorned pictures of Europe with Christian images. But as you go out from Europe, you see these distorted land masses of Africa, Asia, Latin America. They're usually adorned not with Christian images, but with images of savage dogs or two-headed kings or demons. And the whole idea was that as you left Europe, you increasingly went into more chaos and farther away from the Christian world. The idea that the very center of the Christian movement could change and find a new home in Africa or Latin America or in China would be unthinkable in the Middle Ages. And so in some ways, this is about really developing our ecclesiastical cartography, you might say, not just how we have improved our cartography of the world geographically, but our own view of the church and how we understand our place in it. And so typically, having spent many, many hours with students in classes who are studying theology, there's several things that happen when we go through our theological development. Number one, we often overestimate the role of trained Christian leaders in the development of theology. We think about training of leadership and people that have doctorates and have formal training. We're very much unaware of what goes on often among lay people and how theology is done. Secondly, we often look at the church history through the European lens. So when we actually look at church history, we are actually studying not so much Christian history, that is the actual development of the whole worldwide Christian movement, but we're looking at a particular slice of church history with certain kinds of ecclesiastical and historical developments that happens that brings to you where you are, especially if you're a Protestant. You've never known a church that wasn't rooted in the European experience. And so those are massive differences. And so the result of that is that over time, we begin to feel like and regard our theological reflection as normative. So we think about theology, we think about the way we formulate it, we assume that the questions we ask are the questions that everybody asks all over the world. So we're trying to redress that in this book and begin to look at examples, and we'll explore more about how this course will be framed later on. Let me just, at this point, just take a little bit of time to talk about some of the terms that are currently used to describe the church outside of the Western world. You think about the church is growing in Africa and Asia and Latin America. It's growing in the Far East. It's growing in the southern subcontinent of India. The church is growing around the world. How do you talk about this block of the world? If you go back into literature that appeared in the 70s and 80s, the dominant term that was used is the phrase, the non-Western world. The problem with that phrase, of course, is that it defines people by what they're not. They're non-Western. It was considered to be completely inadequate. So as we go into the 80s and 90s, other terms began to be offered, one of which is the term the Third World. The Third World comes from back in the 50s. It was a way of describing the world that was polarized between the democratic Western world and the communist Eastern world. And so those who were non-aligned with either the capitalistic world or the communist world were called generally the Third World, and it did include a lot of countries in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. The problem with that term is that over time, the word and the phrase third world country has become used in a pejorative way. And that's to say, most of you, I think, would immediately resonate with that. If someone says it's a third world country, it's actually today used to refer to places that are unstable, places that have dictatorships, have poverty, crime, other issues, undeveloped in various ways. In 2004, there was Another phrase that became pretty popular and was finally discussed formally in 2004 at the Lausanne Congress, the phrase two-thirds world was used, which was actually a geographic term to refer to literally geographically two-thirds of the world belonged to Asia, Africa, Latin America. So that term was carried on and became part of a forum and happened in Pattaya, Thailand in 2004 called the Two-Thirds World Church. I was at that forum. I was a member of that particular forum, and we had a long discussion about that phrase, and the group voted unanimously asking the church not to refer to them as the two-thirds world, but instead ask us to call them the majority world. So since 2004, that term has been on the rise, and it's mostly what we'll use in this course to refer to the church in Africa, Asia, Latin America, the majority world. But other terms that you'll hear a lot of people refer to the global south as a way of referring to Asia, Africa, Latin America. It's very popular in literature. You'll probably find the phrase global south used about as much as majority world. I personally find Global South a little bit challenging because it makes perfect sense for the growth of the church in Africa. It makes perfect sense for the church in Latin America. But when you get to places like in China or in the explosive church growth in Korea, it's really hard to call Korea the Global South. So to me, it's a little bit of an odd term, but it is used quite a lot. The term post-Western you would think it's inappropriate, but actually sometimes it's appropriate to use the word post-Western to refer to movements that have gone beyond the West in certain ways. And so this is certainly what we will seek to accomplish in this time together in this course, is to try to find ways to best describe what's happened. And some of it is things that are happening that move the church to think differently about theology in other ways because of the influence of the global church. And finally, just on a personal note, let me say that as you listen to these lectures and these conversations introduced, I want to just say that almost any of these could be very disturbing. It's new ideas, it's expressing things in new ways, and so there's things that we said that could be disturbing, it could be startling, disquieting. But like anything else, the church is like a big family, and like any good family, sometimes you have raucous events, but these are conversations that we need to have. We're meeting new members of the church, and you go back into the 19th century, the missionary movement began as mission to the world. They were simply going out to preach the gospel all over the world. But eventually, amazingly and providentially, the church came up. Next thing you know, we're in a conversation with churches, mission to church. And then now these churches are sending out their own missionary works, mission to mission. So the conversation is different. We might say that we gave birth to the church through the amazing seed work of a lot of good, dedicated missionaries and laborers around the world, but these children have grown up. They're no longer adolescents. They're now adults, and they want to be heard and talked to. And so we're now in a new conversation. This whole lecture is about having new conversations with new Christian movements from all over the world.